Donatello's story begins in Florence, the kind of city that seemed to hum with ideas even when the streets were quiet in the early mornings. He was born Donato di Niccolò di Bettobardi around 1386, the son of a wool carder, which wasn't the sort of background that destined someone for artistic fame. Florence at the time was noisy, crowded, a city where bells rang from a dozen towers and merchants shouted prices across the Piazza della Signoria, and yet beneath that surface was a current of something far greater, a collective obsession with beauty, order, and the revival of classical antiquity. It's tempting to imagine the boy Donato walking past churches and noticing the half-finished statues, the carved portals, the painted frescoes, feeling a kind of tug in his chest that told him stone wasn't just stone. He didn't grow up in privilege, but he grew up in the very place where privilege paid for genius, and that made all the difference. Florence at the end of the 14th century was messy and radiant in equal measure. There were guilds, the arti, each jealously guarding its profession and funding its own chapels and artworks. These guilds weren't just professional associations, they were the engines of civic pride, pouring money into cathedrals and public sculptures to prove their worth. So, when you were a boy like Donato, growing up in a craftsman's family, you couldn't help but breathe in marble dust and hear debates about proportion, beauty, and civic duty. His father might have expected him to take up the wool trade, but Florence had a way of bending the paths of young men toward its own restless projects. What really shaped Donatello's youth wasn't only the physical city, but the intellectual air. The Florentine elite were rediscovering classical texts, Cicero, Virgil, Plato, thanks to scholars like Coluccio Salutati and later Poggio Bracciolini, who treated dusty manuscripts as treasure maps. Art was no longer just devotional, it was becoming a mirror of human ambition, dignity, and even desire. In that mix, young Donato's hands would find purpose. He probably began with small tasks, learning to cut stone, to smooth surfaces, to trace outlines. Goldsmith shops doubled as training grounds for sculptors because the skills overlapped: precision, patience, and a willingness to coax beauty out of stubborn material. And Florence was full of masters who would notice a boy who worked hard, listened closely, and had a spark of daring. You know what's fascinating? We often imagine great artists as loners, born with an innate, untouchable gift. But in Florence, talent was spotted early and woven into networks. Donatello's early years likely included running errands for older craftsmen, sweeping up chips of marble, and peeking when no one was watching at sketches pinned on the walls. It's the kind of environment where curiosity didn't get you scolded, it got you tested. And Donatello passed those quiet tests. Somewhere between childhood and adolescence, he caught the attention of those who could open doors, and those doors led him into the world of goldsmiths and stonemasons. The timing was uncanny. The Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, was rising above the city, and its dome, still a dream in progress, loomed over the skyline. The project drew every ambitious artist like moths to flame. The baptistry doors, the campanile with niches waiting for saints, the half-carved tombs, they were open invitations. To grow up in Florence during those decades meant you didn't have to search for artistic opportunities, they were on every street corner. And for a boy with Donatello's restless energy, it was almost inevitable that his hands would be pulled toward clay, wax, marble, and bronze. But let's pause for a second and think about the character of Florence itself. This was a city that thrived on contradictions. On one hand, it was deeply religious, with monks preaching against vanity and sin. On the other, it was flamboyantly proud, pouring fortunes into art that glorified human achievement. This tension between humility and pride was something Donatello absorbed without even knowing it. Later, his statues would carry both faces lined with doubt and courage, bodies caught between frailty and strength. Maybe it all started here, as he walked through the crooked alleys and wide piazzas, noticing how people bowed before saints yet strutted like emperors in their silk robes. As Donatello edged into his teenage years, his reputation as an eager learner grew. Apprenticeships were not glamorous. They meant long hours, aching backs, and very little pay. But there's a kind of magic in those repetitive tasks, polishing, sketching, chiseling, that builds a relationship between body and material. By the time most boys were still fidgeting through chores, Donatello was probably feeling at home with a chisel in his hand, reading the resistance of stone like someone else might read a book. What's intriguing is that no early record tells us precisely when or how Donatello decided he was an artist. Maybe he never decided. Maybe he just never stopped. Florence didn't allow for idleness, and those who kept moving forward found themselves swept into greater projects. Before long, Donatello would meet other young talents, Brunelleschi, Ghiberti, and the city would press them together like coal under heat, producing sparks of rivalry and collaboration that would change Western art. But at this first stage, Donatello was just a boy of Florence, his future still unwritten, standing at the edge of a city that wanted statues to speak louder than sermons and buildings to defy the heavens. And honestly, isn't that where all great stories begin? With a young person in a city, with dust on their shoes and ambition in their chest, not yet knowing that history is waiting for their touch. Apprenticeship in Renaissance Florence wasn't a casual arrangement, it was an all-consuming pact between a boy and the craft. For Donatello, this meant stepping into the world of goldsmiths and stonemasons, trades that were as respected as they were grueling. These were men whose hands were constantly nicked and blackened, whose backs bore the permanent ache of leaning over workbenches or wrestling blocks of marble. And yet, they were also guardians of secrets: how to coax fire into shaping gold, how to read veins in stone, how to make a tool sing rather than scrape. When Donatello entered this environment, he wasn't entering a school in the modern sense. He was entering a family that tested loyalty, endurance, and curiosity at every turn. Goldsmithing in Florence was a crucible for artistic talent. Why? Because it demanded precision at a microscopic level. A goldsmith had to carve wax models, create molds, pour molten metal, and chase details so fine they seemed invisible until light struck them. This was the perfect training ground for Donatello, who would later become a master of bronze casting and surface detail. Imagine him at a bench, filing down a piece no bigger than a thumb, sweat stinging his eyes, his master watching with a frown until the angle was perfect. Every slip was noticed, every success quietly filed away. There was no room for mediocrity, and Donatello absorbed that lesson early. Stonemasonry was its own education. It wasn't dainty, it was about strength and rhythm, hammer and chisel carving out forms that only lived in the mind's eye. Apprentices like Donatello learned to listen to the stone, to sense when a strike would free a shape or when it would shatter the entire block. Florence's workshops buzzed with this noise: chisels tapping, mallets thudding, stone dust clouding the air until the sunbeams looked like golden spears cutting through the haze. Donatello grew strong in this environment, but more importantly, he grew patient. Marble doesn't yield to impatience. It punishes haste. That patience would define his career as much as his daring experiments would. Here's the thing: apprenticeship wasn't just about technical skill. It was also about discipline, humility, and learning to survive under harsh masters. Stories survive of young apprentices being berated, even beaten, for mistakes. Donatello probably endured his share of humiliation, yet he kept showing up, kept carving, kept refining. This ability to persist through discomfort gave him an edge later, when projects dragged on for years or patrons demanded the impossible. He had trained under men who expected nothing less than perfection, and it hardened him without killing his curiosity. We can't ignore how social apprenticeship was, either. Workshops were melting pots of personalities: brash young boys, cautious veterans, and masters who alternated between inspiration and tyranny. In those rooms, Donatello would have met fellow apprentices who would become lifelong rivals or collaborators. It's almost certain that during this time he crossed paths with Lorenzo Ghiberti, whose workshop would dominate Florentine sculpture for decades, and perhaps even the young Filippo Brunelleschi, who, like Donatello, was straining against the limits of tradition. Those encounters lit sparks. Apprentices watched one another constantly, stealing tricks, competing for praise, and dreaming of commissions that seemed unreachable. Honestly, What makes this stage of Donatello's life so fascinating is how invisible it seems at first glance. No grand works survive from those early years, no records boast of his name. Yet, everything he would later achieve, the daring of the Bronze David, the solemn power of Gadamelida, the raw humanity of his pulpits, was seated in these long, unglamorous hours in the workshop. Apprenticeship was less about genius and more about resilience. And resilience is often the soil where genius eventually grows. There's also the matter of timing. Apprenticeships in Florence were tied to the guild system. To advance, you needed to belong or at least be sponsored. The Arte della Lana, the Wool Guild, had connections with Donatello's family, but the real powerhouses for sculptors were the Arte dei Maestri di Pietra e Legname, stoneworkers and woodworkers, and the Arte della Seta, Silk Guild, which controlled bronze casting. Donatello's training gave him pathways into both worlds. That flexibility would later allow him to shift between marble, bronze, wood, and clay with a freedom most sculptors lacked. So picture this: a teenage Donatello, tired from carrying tools across town, sneaking glances at the baptistry's gilded doors under construction. He knew he was at the bottom of the ladder, but he also knew the ladder was there, and others had climbed it. His apprenticeship wasn't glamorous, but it was the foundation. Without those years of grueling practice, he wouldn't have had the technical courage to break rules later. And breaking rules was exactly what Florence, teetering between Gothic tradition and classical rebirth, was waiting for. By the time Donatello's apprenticeship matured, he wasn't just another boy with a hammer. He was someone who could imagine form beyond what tradition dictated, someone who saw stone not only as material but as possibility. And in that restless energy, the Florence of the early 1400s found one of its most daring sons. Donatello's path crossed with Filippo Brunelleschi at just the right moment, and it wasn't simply coincidence, it was Florence working its peculiar alchemy. Both were young, ambitious, and restless, and both were bumping up against the limits of what their masters and guilds thought acceptable. Brunelleschi, a goldsmith-turned-architect, had an almost scientific curiosity about proportion and mechanics, while Donatello was already beginning to see figures not as stiff saints locked in niches, but as breathing, flawed, emotional humans. When the two of them found each other, it was like two sparks meeting dry kindling. Ideas leapt into flame. Their friendship wasn't based only on mutual admiration. It had something sharper: competition, banter, perhaps even a shared sense of being outsiders among the rule-bound workshops. Picture them walking through Florence's narrow alleys, still in dusty aprons, arguing about how a face should look in marble or how a vault might stand without collapsing. Apprentices didn't usually dream of rewriting the book on architecture or sculpture. But these two did. The city's atmosphere encouraged it. Everywhere, patrons were talking about the antique ancient Rome's architecture, statues, and inscriptions. But only a few dared to ask what that could mean for the present. Donatello and Brunelleschi weren't content to copy. They wanted to revive and reimagine. Here's the thing: friendships like theirs often work because the temperaments don't mirror but complement. Brunelleschi was methodical, calculating angles and experimenting with machines. Donatello was intuitive, rougher, guided by an instinct for how flesh and spirit could be trapped in bronze or marble. Together, they challenged each other in ways no solitary artist could. Brunelleschi might sketch a mathematically precise dome, and Donatello might laugh, saying, "But where's the soul?" Donatello could carve a saint's furrowed brow, and Brunelleschi would press him to think about how light would strike it, how shadow could amplify the emotion. It wasn't long before this camaraderie turned into actual partnership. One of the boldest adventures of their youth was their journey to Rome. Think about that decision. Two relatively unknown young men packing tools and notebooks, leaving behind the safety of Florence's workshops and setting off into a city that was, at the time, half in ruins and half a stage for the papacy's grandeur. For Florentines, Rome was more than a destination, it was a proving ground. To study ruins firsthand meant to drink from the source. Donatello and Brunelleschi didn't just gawk at columns and amphitheaters, they measured, sketched, debated, and filled notebooks. Centuries later, Vasari would tell stories of them digging in the dirt like treasure hunters, uncovering fragments of statues and inscriptions. Why does that matter? Because their Roman adventure planted seeds that would grow in everything they did afterward. Brunelleschi would use what he saw to rethink how space could be built, culminating in his solution for Florence's impossible cathedral dome. Donatello would absorb the muscular presence of Roman statues, the realism of their gestures, the commanding weight of their drapery. This wasn't imitation, it was assimilation. They were rewriting the vocabulary of art using an ancient dictionary. Honestly, what strikes me most is the audacity. They were still apprentices in many ways, with no guarantees of commissions waiting back home, and yet they believed they had the right to learn from Rome itself. That confidence, or arrogance, depending on how you see it, wasn't misplaced. Florence was entering a period where such boldness was exactly what patrons craved. When Donatello and Brunelleschi returned, they weren't the same boys who had left. They had seen ruins rise into lessons, and they carried those lessons like contraband back to Florence. Their friendship didn't last forever in harmony later. They would clash bitterly, especially as Brunelleschi's star rose with the cathedral dome and Donatello pursued his own daring experiments in bronze and stone. But in these formative years, they were allies, co-conspirators in a quiet rebellion against stiffness and convention. Florence, buzzing with guild rivalries and Medici politics, needed exactly that kind of energy. And so the friendship of Donatello and Brunelleschi became not just a personal bond, but a crucible in which the Renaissance itself was refined. Rome at the start of the 15th century wasn't the postcard city we picture today. It was half grandeur, half ruin, a place where ancient temples lay collapsed beside new churches, where goats grazed among broken columns, and where marble blocks from imperial forums were carted off to be ground into lime for mortar. For Donatello and Brunelleschi, still young men without fame, the city must have felt like a ghost of a giant, intimidating, overwhelming, and yet irresistibly magnetic. They weren't tourists. They came to Rome with sketchbooks and hunger in their eyes, determined to understand what the ancients knew that their own teachers had forgotten. The decision itself was daring. Travel wasn't simple, and there was no guarantee of commissions waiting back home if they abandoned Florence. But the call of antiquity was too strong. Brunelleschi's mind was already turning toward architecture. He wanted to know how the Romans had spanned wide spaces without the structures collapsing. Donatello, meanwhile, was more interested in bodies, gestures, and the play of drapery across stone. Rome was the best school imaginable, and the tuition was the dust of ruins. The pair spent days wandering through overgrown forums, measuring columns with cords, crouching in the dirt to copy inscriptions, and arguing under their breath as if the marble torsos and battered busts could overhear their critiques. You can almost picture them. Brunelleschi carefully charting the Pantheon's proportions, muttering calculations as he compared diameter and height, while Donatello sketched the curve of a Roman soldier's arm or the twist of a toga in mid-motion. Their methods were different, but the effect was the same. They were learning to see beyond Gothic convention, beyond the elongated saints and rigid Madonnas that filled Florence's churches. In Rome, they saw figures grounded in gravity, bodies with weight, architecture that didn't soar in pointed arches, but rested in massive harmony. This contrast would change everything for them. There's a story, likely embroidered by Vasari, but still worth repeating, that they even dug into the soil of ancient sites, unearthing fragments with their own hands, treating Rome like a treasure chest. Whether or not that literally happened, the spirit of it rings true. They weren't content with surface admiration. They wanted to dissect antiquity, to break it apart and rebuild it inside their own imaginations. That appetite, that boldness, is what separated them from the safe, guild-bound artists who never looked beyond their city walls. And here's the thing, Rome wasn't merely a teacher of forms, it was also a mirror of ambition. The papacy was reasserting itself, rebuilding parts of the city, trying to stitch together authority after years of schism. To see ruins rising alongside new projects was to see time collapse in on itself. For Donatello, that meant realizing that art didn't belong only to the past. Ancient grandeur could be reclaimed, reshaped, and made to speak again. He wasn't just copying Roman reliefs, he was absorbing their confidence, their unapologetic physicality, their insistence on presence. When they finally returned to Florence, they weren't the same men who had left. Brunelleschi carried in his mind the seeds of the dome that would later crown Santa Maria del Fiore, that impossible project that had haunted Florence for decades. Donatello came back with a new vocabulary, one where marble saints could stand like soldiers, where bronze reliefs could open into space as if the wall itself had depth, where biblical figures looked less like heavenly ideals and more like citizens you might meet in the marketplace. Honestly, the Roman sojourn feels like one of those pivotal crossroads in history. If they hadn't gone, if they'd stayed in their workshops, Florence might never have birthed the Renaissance in quite the same way. Their sketches and measurements weren't just academic exercises, they were blueprints for a cultural revolution. And Donatello, in particular, carried Rome's ghosts back into his hands, ready to translate them into works that would make marble and bronze breathe again. When Donatello returned to Florence from Rome, the city wasn't exactly waiting with open arms. He was still a young man, not yet established, and Florence was crawling with talent. The Baptistry Doors project alone had drawn some of the best sculptors in Italy: Ghiberti, Jacopo della Quercia, even Brunelleschi before he turned his back on it. Patrons weren't short on choices, which meant Donatello had to prove himself in small, often overlooked ways. And yet, those early commissions, modest as they might seem now, were where his voice began to emerge. The first works he received were tied to the cathedral project, that massive, sprawling endeavor which seemed to soak up every sculptor in Florence. Santa Maria del Fiore needed saints for niches, prophets for portals, apostles to stand guard. Donatello, still untested, was handed smaller assignments, figures not destined for the most prominent spots, but still important to the overall program. For most apprentices turned journeymen, these tasks were opportunities to demonstrate competence, nothing more. But Donatello approached them differently. He wasn't content with generic faces or stylized gestures. He wanted individuality. He wanted humanity. Even in minor saints, he began to carve features that looked as if they belonged to real men you might encounter in Florence's piazzas. One of his early triumphs in this phase was his marble Saint John the Evangelist, made for a cathedral niche. Unlike the delicate, youthful John's other artists favored, Donatello gave him weight, gravity, an older, solemn figure whose drapery folds carried a sense of substance. His John wasn't ethereal. He was flesh and bone, hunched slightly, with a seriousness that pulled him down to earth. This kind of realism startled viewers. Some admired it as a return to Roman dignity. Others muttered that it was too plain, too human, almost unbecoming for a saint. But the piece got people talking, and in Florence, that was half the battle. Here's the thing, these early commissions revealed Donatello's daring streak long before his reputation was secured. A less confident sculptor might have stuck to Gothic elegance, elongated figures, serene faces, neat folds of drapery. Donatello instead risked criticism by carving what he saw rather than what tradition demanded. That willingness to court disapproval in pursuit of honesty became a signature of his career. He wasn't reckless, exactly, but he refused to flatter either patrons or viewers with empty beauty. At the same time, Donatello was learning the brutal politics of commissions. Florence was a web of rivalries, artists jockeying for favor, guilds using public works to advertise their wealth, and families like the Medici keeping a keen eye on who might serve their interests. Donatello didn't yet have the Medici at his back. He was working within the cathedral's vast, committee-driven framework, where decisions were slow and egos easily bruised. Still, his early works attracted notice. Word spread through workshops and guild halls that there was a young sculptor unafraid to push forms closer to life, a sculptor who seemed more interested in how a man felt than in how he fit into Gothic pattern books. Imagine Donatello in this stage, not yet famous, but walking through the Piazza del Duomo and seeing his figures set into place, high above eye level, becoming part of Florence's skyline. That had to have felt both exhilarating and frustrating. Exhilarating because his work was literally built into the city's bones. Frustrating because the niches were small, the visibility limited, and the commissions not enough to set him apart. He needed something bolder, something that would declare his arrival unmistakably. That something would come soon with his Marble David, but these first commissions gave him the grounding. They were like sketches before the masterpiece, practice runs where he tested not just technical skill but artistic daring. Honestly, I think that's what makes this period so compelling. We see Donatello wrestling with himself, torn between tradition and instinct, caught between the safety of convention and the thrill of experimentation. Florence was watching, patrons were whispering, rivals were frowning. And in the midst of it all, a young man was quietly preparing to redefine what sculpture could be. The commission for Donatello's Marble David marked a turning point, not only in his career, but in Florence's sense of itself. The city had always seen David, the shepherd boy who defeated Goliath with nothing but a sling and courage, as a kind of mascot. Small but defiant, standing against overwhelming odds, David mirrored Florence's own self-image, a republic surrounded by larger, more powerful rivals like Milan and Naples, yet unwilling to bow. By handing the young Donatello the subject, the cathedral's overseers may not have realized they were unleashing a declaration. The David Donatello produced in marble wasn't the later bronze masterpiece everyone talks about. This one was an earlier work, carved around 1408-09, when he was still finding his footing. And yet, even here, you can sense the boldness. The figure stands youthful, almost slender, but not in the Gothic manner of elongated elegance. Donatello gave him mass and presence. His pose is firm, his face determined, his body grounded. This wasn't a decorative ornament. It was a boy who looked as though he had stepped out of the biblical story into the Florentine streets. You know what's remarkable? He managed to balance naturalism with symbolism. The Marble David doesn't overwhelm with physicality, but it conveys something deeper: readiness, vigilance, and the quiet pride of victory. There's a tension in the face, a subtle clench in the muscles, that makes you feel the battle has only just ended, or maybe is still about to begin. For Florentines walking past, this was more than a statue. It was a mirror of their own identity, placed not in some obscure chapel, but in the heart of their most important civic and religious project. This statue also hints at Donatello's knack for working with scale. Marble is heavy, stubborn, and unyielding, yet he coaxed it into youthful flesh. Unlike the static saints of Gothic niches, David's stance felt dynamic, balanced but alive. You could walk around him and sense movement, the kind of subtle shift that later artists, most famously Michelangelo, would push to extremes. In fact, Michelangelo's David of a century later can be seen as a direct descendant of Donatello's earlier effort. Without Donatello's Marble David setting the precedent, Michelangelo's heroic nude might never have found its foothold. Here's the thing: Donatello's Marble David also opened doors. Patrons began to see him as more than just another workshop-trained sculptor. He had handled a significant subject, delivered something both faithful to tradition and quietly radical, and made people talk. That chatter mattered in Florence. Commissions often went not to the best artist in some abstract sense, but to the one whose work stirred conversation, whose style made viewers stop and argue. Donatello had now entered that arena. At the same time, this statue reflects his connection to the city's politics. Florence, always proud of its republican ideals, at least on paper, loved to see itself in biblical underdogs. By carving David, Donatello wasn't just creating a religious figure, he was reinforcing Florence's myth about itself. And in doing so, he aligned his art with civic identity, a move that would serve him well when the powerful Medici family later stepped into his life. What's almost poetic is that the Marble David was both a beginning and a rehearsal. It showed Donatello's promise, but it wasn't yet his final word on the subject. Years later, when he returned to David in bronze, he would push the idea into territory so provocative it still unsettles viewers today. But without this first attempt, the marble boy with his grounded stance, his clear eyes, his youthful but unyielding strength, he might never have had the confidence to reimagine the story so radically. Honestly, I think of this marble David as Donatello's handshake with Florence. He was saying, "Here I am. I can give you heroes, but they'll look like you, not distant saints. They'll stand with your pride, your anxieties, your defiance." And Florence, fiercely proud and always hungry for novelty, was ready to listen. After the marble David came into the world, Donatello didn't retreat into safe territory. He pressed forward, carving figures that were startling in their presence. One of the most striking early examples was his Saint John the Evangelist, commissioned for the facade of the Florence Cathedral. Now, if you think about how most Gothic saints looked, elongated, serene, and almost weightless, Donatello's John feels like a thunderclap. He's seated, robed heavily, and when you look at him, you see not just a symbol of holiness, but an old man, weary and wise, carrying the burden of thought. The folds of John's robe aren't neat patterns, as if carved from a design book. They're deep, heavy, and they press down on him like time itself. His hands are strong, his gaze intense, and there's a realism that almost makes you uncomfortable. Saints weren't usually supposed to look so human. They were meant to radiate divine calm, a kind of spiritual perfection. But Donatello carved John with sagging cheeks, sunken eyes, and a posture that reveals the strain of a long life. In other words, he gave him dignity through humanity rather than through idealization. That was revolutionary. You know what's fascinating? People at the time didn't quite know what to make of this. Some were awed by the weight of it, literally and figuratively. Others whispered that it was too plain, too ordinary, almost disrespectful to strip a saint of heavenly distance. But that was exactly Donatello's gift. He believed holiness didn't need to float above reality. It could be found in the wrinkles of a face, the heaviness of a body, the intensity of a stare. He made saints that people could believe in because they looked like people they already knew: aged merchants, tired fathers, stern elders sitting on church steps. And here's the thing, Saint John the Evangelist wasn't just realism for realism's sake. Donatello had learned in Rome how classical sculpture conveyed weight, balance, and presence. He used those lessons here, but he twisted them to fit Christian storytelling. John isn't an emperor or a Roman soldier. He's a thinker, a writer, a witness to divine mystery. His heavy robe, his grounded body, his inward gaze, they all point to a mind deeply engaged with truth. In this way, Donatello wasn't abandoning spirituality. He was redefining how it could be represented. This carving also shows us Donatello's genius with scale. The statue was meant to be placed high up on the cathedral facade, and when you view it from below, the proportions shift into harmony. The elongated torso, the exaggerated folds, they don't look strange at a distance. They look perfect. Up close, you might think his choice is odd, but Donatello wasn't sculpting for studio inspection. He was sculpting for a city, for thousands of eyes tilted upward. That understanding of public space, of how art meets its viewers in real contexts, set him apart from many of his peers. What's almost ironic is that this raw, almost unsettling John helped pave the way for Donatello's later reputation as an innovator. Patrons began to recognize that if they wanted something more than decoration, if they wanted works that stirred emotion, provoked thought, or embodied civic values, Donatello was their man. He wasn't always easy to digest, but he was impossible to ignore. Honestly, I can't help but imagine Florentines standing in the piazza, pointing up at John, debating whether he looked too gruff, too earthly, or just right. That debate itself was part of the work's success. Donatello wasn't sculpting to lull, he was sculpting to spark. And that restless spark was only just beginning to catch fire in his career. The commission for St. George came from the Armorers Guild of Florence, and if you think about it, that was a perfect pairing. Who better to represent their trade than a warrior saint, standing guard with shield and sword? Yet what Donatello delivered was more than a proud emblem for a guild. His St. George, carved around 1415 and placed in a niche at Orsamachil, was a revelation. It wasn't simply a statue of a saint. It was a portrait of youthful courage caught at the moment before action, with vulnerability still etched in the face. Florence had no shortage of saints in stone. Walk through the city and you'd pass niches filled with Gothic figures, aloof, elongated, noble in their stiff dignity. Donatello broke that pattern. His George is upright, yes, but not stiff. His shield is planted in front of him, his body subtly tense, as if he's bracing himself for what's coming. His face is extraordinary. The eyes are wide, the brows knit, the lips pressed. This isn't a triumphant warrior gloating over victory. This is a young man staring down the unknown, summoning courage he isn't entirely sure he has. That choice was daring. Saints were often presented as serene, already victorious, their holiness insulating them from fear. Donatello's George is in the moment. He hasn't slain the dragon yet. He's still mustering the will to fight. That humanity made him relatable to Florentines, many of whom knew what it meant to feel small against larger powers. Remember, Florence itself identified with David, the boy against the giant. In George, they saw a similar mirror, defiance paired with doubt, courage drawn from necessity rather than from divine invincibility. And Donatello didn't stop with the statue itself. Beneath the figure, he carved a shallow marble relief of St. George and the dragon. This little panel is one of the first examples of his invention of rilievo schiacciato, literally squashed relief. The figures are barely raised from the background, almost like drawings in stone, but through masterful use of perspective, Donatello created depth. The buildings recede, the landscape stretches, and George on horseback charges forward as if space itself has opened behind him. This was radical. Reliefs before Donatello were deeper, more crowded, less atmospheric. Here, he used the subtlest carving to suggest endless distance. He wasn't just telling a story, he was pulling the viewer into it. You know what? That combination, the upright figure above and the narrative relief below, was a stroke of genius. The statue embodied potential, the moment before action, while the relief showed the action itself, the dragon already slain. Together, they formed a dialogue about fear, courage, and victory. The saint wasn't a static icon, he was a character in a drama, unfolding right before Florentine eyes. This work also shows Donatello's growing mastery of psychology. Look closely at George's face, and you'll see not just bravery but anxiety, not just resolve but hesitation. That layering of emotions wasn't common in sculpture of the time. Most artists gave their saints one expression: serene, triumphant, mournful. Donatello gave his George a soul that shifted as you looked at him. Sometimes he seems defiant, sometimes vulnerable. It depends on where you stand, how the light strikes, even how you're feeling when you see him. That's not just technical brilliance, it's empathy carved in marble. Florentines noticed. The Armorers Guild was proud to have such a guardian representing them at Orsanmichele, and passers-by couldn't ignore the difference between Donatello's George and the neighboring saints by other sculptors. There was a vitality, a tension, a modernity to it, even though Donatello had learned much of his inspiration from the ruins of antiquity. He wasn't imitating the past. He was making it breathe again, but in a way that spoke to the fears and hopes of his own city. Honestly, when I think about St. George, I think of it as Donatello's declaration of independence. He was saying, I won't give you saints that are statues. I'll give you statues that are people. And that, more than any single innovation, is why his work feels alive even 6 centuries later. When Donatello turned his attention to bronze reliefs, he wasn't just tinkering with a new medium, he was practically rewriting the rules of how space, story, and emotion could live inside a slab of metal. The piece that really announced this shift was the Feast of Herod, created around 1423–27 for the baptismal font in Siena's cathedral. On paper, the subject was gruesome, the banquet at which Salome presents the severed head of John the Baptist to King Herod. In another artist's hands, it could have been stiff, symbolic, maybe even sanitized. But Donatello made it into a stage, filled with drama, perspective, and emotions so raw that viewers must have gasped. Imagine standing in Siena and peering at this bronze panel. The first thing you'd notice is the depth Donatello used his new invention, rilievo schiacciato, flattened relief, to conjure space that seemed to stretch far behind the figures. In the foreground, the action is immediate. Herod recoils, guests look horrified, Salome hovers with the grisly platter. Behind them, columns and arches recede in perfect linear perspective, drawing your eye back into the room as if the wall itself had melted into depth. It was one of the first times in sculpture that perspective, something Brunelleschi was pioneering in drawing, was used so boldly. Donatello wasn't just carving bodies, he was carving air, distance, architecture. Here's the thing, the Feast of Herod isn't just about technical brilliance. It's about psychological storytelling. Look at Herod's face. He isn't a generic king reacting to a symbol. He's a man visibly shaken, his body twisting, his hands thrown up in dread. The guests around him don't all respond the same way. Some gape in shock, others whisper in horror, a few seem to shrink back in their seats. That variety of reaction turns the relief into a living drama. It's not one emotion repeated, it's a chorus of different voices, like you'd see in an actual crowd. And Donatello, never one to flinch from uncomfortable truth, didn't soften the gruesome detail. John's head is unmistakably there, a shocking centerpiece. But rather than linger on gore, Donatello makes the reactions the true subject. It's almost modern in that sense. The horror is reflected through the people watching, much like a film director today might cut away from the event itself to show the stunned faces of an audience. Florentines who saw this relief must have recognized that Donatello was pulling something from painting into sculpture. The perspective grids, the layered space, the narrative sequencing, these were things painters were experimenting with on flat surfaces. Donatello was proving that bronze could do the same, maybe even better. He gave sculpture a cinematic quality, as if you were looking at a still frame from an unfolding story. You know what's ironic? Bronze reliefs were often considered secondary commissions compared to full statues. They were decoration, part of a larger program. But in Donatello's hands, they became showcases of invention. Patrons began to see that giving him even a panel could yield breakthroughs no one else dared attempt. The Siena Feast of Herod wasn't just another piece of a baptismal font, it was a manifesto cast in bronze. Honestly, I think about how radical it must have felt at the time. To stand in front of this relief, in a cathedral where most art still clung to Gothic stiffness, and suddenly see space open, figures react, emotions ripple, it must have felt as though the very walls were coming alive. Donatello was proving that sculpture didn't have to be static, that bronze could capture not just form but fear, tension, and even silence. With the Feast of Herod, he didn't just advance his own career. He nudged the entire Renaissance forward. If marble was a test of patience and strength, bronze was a test of nerve. Working in bronze required a completely different mindset, part sculptor, part chemist, part engineer. Donatello mastered it. In fact, he didn't just master it, he reinvented it. His experiments with lost wax casting, Cire Perdue as the French would later call it, pushed the medium further than almost anyone before him, and the results changed how Renaissance artists thought about sculpture. The process itself was terrifyingly complex. First, you sculpted the figure in wax. Then you coated it in layers of clay or plaster to form a mold, heated it until the wax melted and drained out, and finally poured molten bronze into the hollow space. If anything went wrong, the wax too thin, the mold too brittle, the bronze too hot, the piece could be ruined in an instant. Weeks, even months, of work might literally crack apart. You had to trust not only your hands, but also the fire. Most sculptors kept their bronzes small, manageable, medallions, busts, little reliefs, because the risks grew exponentially with size. Donatello wasn't content with that. He wanted bronze to carry the same monumental authority as marble. That meant scaling up, experimenting with thinner walls, more daring compositions, and technical tricks to save weight and prevent collapse. His Feast of Herod reliefs in Siena were already marvels of technical daring, the figures cast so shallow that they seemed to hover on the surface. Later, his bronze David and the equestrian Gadamelida would demand even greater leaps of engineering. What's fascinating is how Donatello's experiments blurred the line between artist and craftsman. In Florence, sculptors were often viewed as artisans skilled, yes, but not intellectuals like poets or philosophers. Yet Donatello, by mastering the alchemy of bronze, proved that sculpture was both art and science. He had to calculate flows, anticipate cooling, plan for shrinkage and cracks. Each statue was a gamble. And each success made him not just a respected artist, but a kind of magician in the eyes of patrons. Here's the thing, Donatello didn't keep to safe formulas. He was willing to risk failure, which is why his bronzes feel so alive. Reliefs like the Feast of Herod show him shaving the depth down to millimeters, creating illusions of space with almost no material. Later, in the David, he cast delicate curls of hair, the soft bend of a knee, details so fine that many doubted they could survive in bronze. He trusted his process, and it paid off. And yet, for all his daring, Donatello wasn't reckless. He surrounded himself with skilled metalworkers, often collaborating with artisans who specialized in the foundry side of things. He listened, learned, and then pushed them further than they thought possible. You could say he treated bronze like a conversation. He asked, "What can you handle?" and then demanded just a little bit more. Honestly, this part of his career shows us something essential about Donatello's temperament. He wasn't content being just a carver, nor was he satisfied copying the ancients. He wanted to test materials until they revealed something new. He wanted to see if molten metal, once cooled, could look like living flesh, shifting drapery, or open space. And by doing so, he gave bronze a vocabulary it had never spoken before in Christian art. It's no accident that future giants, Verrocchio, Cellini, even Michelangelo, looked back to Donatello's bronzes as proof that ambition in metal was possible. The lost wax method was ancient, but Donatello's restless experiments gave it Renaissance boldness. He wasn't simply reviving a technique, he was reinventing what it could mean for art. Florence in the early 15th century wasn't just a city of artists, it was a city of rivalries. Nowhere was that more obvious than in the relationship between Donatello and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Ghiberti was the golden boy, the man who had won the famous baptistry doors competition in 1401, beating out none other than Brunelleschi. His victory gave him prestige, commissions, and the kind of reputation that made guilds line up to hire him. Donatello, meanwhile, was still climbing. Their paths crossed often, and though they weren't always outright enemies, the tension between them defined much of Florence's sculptural landscape. Here's the thing, Ghiberti and Donatello couldn't have been more different. Ghiberti was elegant, polished, the darling of committees. He delivered works that were refined, technically flawless, and pleasing to the conservative tastes of guild patrons. His figures looked graceful, his reliefs balanced, his surfaces smooth as silk. Donatello, on the other hand, was rougher, more daring, more unpredictable. He wasn't interested in pleasing everyone. His saints had wrinkles, his warriors had fear in their eyes, and his reliefs sometimes looked more like sketches in stone than polished ornaments. Where Ghiberti charmed, Donatello provoked. Florentine commissions often became battlegrounds between these approaches. Take Orsanmichele, that grand church whose niches were being filled with statues by different guilds. Ghiberti contributed sleek, elegant figures. Donatello carved his St. George, tense and alive, staring out at the street as if daring passers-by to challenge him. Viewers couldn't help but compare the two. Did they prefer the polished serenity of Ghiberti or the raw vitality of Donatello? That debate wasn't just aesthetic, it was political. Guilds wanted their saints to represent their values. Choosing between Ghiberti and Donatello was like choosing between tradition and innovation. And the politics didn't stop with style. Commissions in Florence were controlled by committees, which meant backroom deals, guild rivalries, and no small amount of lobbying. Ghiberti, smooth-talking and well-connected, often won these contests. Donatello, less charming in the political sense, sometimes lost out. But when he did win, it was usually because someone wanted boldness, something that would stand out rather than blend in. That made him valuable to certain patrons, especially those looking to make statements about power and identity. Honestly, the rivalry with Ghiberti might have been frustrating, but it also pushed Donatello forward. He couldn't compete with Ghiberti by playing the same game. So he leaned harder into his own strengths, psychological realism, dramatic invention, daring technique. Instead of smoothing out his saints, he carved them with veins bulging, brows furrowed, and robes heavy as stone. Instead of filling reliefs with orderly, graceful figures, he let chaos, fear, and motion enter the scene. He created works that felt lived in, even if they risked looking rough compared to Ghiberti's polish. What's almost poetic is how time judged them. In their own day, Ghiberti was celebrated as the supreme craftsman of Florence, his gates of paradise earning praise across Italy. Donatello was respected, but often controversial, admired more by daring patrons than by cautious committees. And yet, centuries later, it's Donatello who feels startlingly modern, whose works still speak with raw immediacy. Ghiberti's doors are masterpieces of elegance, yes, but Donatello's sculptures throb with life. The rivalry also reinforced Donatello's bond with Brunelleschi. Both of them had felt Ghiberti's shadow, Brunelleschi in losing the baptistry doors competition, Donatello in competing for cathedral and guild commissions. Their partnership, their Roman studies, even their willingness to challenge norms, all carried an undercurrent of defiance against Ghiberti's dominance. In a way, Ghiberti became the wall they both pushed against, and that resistance made them stronger. So when you look at Florence in these years, you don't just see a city producing masterpieces. You see a city buzzing with competition, egos colliding, committees scheming, and artists sharpening themselves against rivals. And in that storm, Donatello carved out his place, not by trying to outcharm Ghiberti, but by being bolder, stranger, and, ultimately, unforgettable. By the time Donatello's reputation began to rise beyond the chatter of workshops and guild halls, Florence itself was shifting. The Medici family, wealthy bankers with a knack for threading power through art, politics, and religion, were starting to cement themselves as the city's quiet rulers. And Donatello, restless, daring, not always the easiest personality, stepped directly into their orbit. This wasn't just luck. It was a convergence of ambition. The Medici wanted art that reflected their influence, and Donatello wanted patrons willing to gamble on his bold ideas. Cosimo de' Medici, often called Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, recognized in Donatello something other patrons overlooked. Most guild committees wanted safe statues, orderly saints, predictable Madonnas, smooth classical grace. Cosimo wanted art that spoke, art that whispered or shouted of Florence's vitality and of the Medici's taste as its guiding hand. Donatello's rawness, his insistence on psychological depth, fit perfectly. It gave the Medici not just beautiful objects, but statements of cultural leadership. The partnership wasn't only about prestige, it was personal, too. Donatello had a reputation for being blunt, even difficult. He didn't flatter patrons. He demanded freedom to experiment. For some sponsors, that was intolerable. For Cosimo, it was invigorating. Their relationship grew into one of mutual trust. Donatello knew Cosimo would shield him from committee meddling. Cosimo knew Donatello would deliver works that made Florence talk. And in Renaissance Florence, being talked about was half the game. One of the first signs of this partnership came in smaller commissions for the Medici household and their chapels. Reliefs, statues, even architectural decoration, all became avenues for Donatello's restless imagination. Soon enough, Cosimo offered him greater challenges, works that would shape not only the family's image, but the very identity of the city. Think of the Bronze David, housed in the Medici Palace courtyard, a piece that was as much a family emblem as it was a civic symbol. Without Cosimo's daring, would that controversial, sensual, groundbreaking statue ever have been made? Probably not. Here's the thing, Medici patronage gave Donatello room to fail. And failure, paradoxically, is what allowed him to succeed so spectacularly. He could try techniques that other patrons would have balked at, flattened reliefs that looked almost too sketchy, wooden crucifixes so raw they bordered on grotesque, bronze castings that risked collapsing under their own daring. The Medici shielded him, celebrated him, and showcased his works as proof that their Florence was the beating heart of the Renaissance. This alliance also tied Donatello into politics, whether he liked it or not. Every commission for the Medici was also a message. We, the Medici, are not only rich, we are the arbiters of taste, the patrons of genius, the guardians of Florence's identity. Donatello's works in their palaces and chapels became as much about Medici power as about artistic brilliance. It was a double-edged sword. His career soared, but his name was forever entwined with theirs, for better and for worse. Honestly, I think this was the moment Donatello stopped being just a sculptor and became a cultural force. With the Medici behind him, he wasn't scrambling for guild commissions or competing endlessly with Ghiberti. He was free to experiment, to push, to risk. And in doing so, he didn't just serve the Medici, he helped Florence redefine itself as a city where art was politics and politics was art. When Donatello unveiled his bronze David, sometime in the 1440s, Florence must have paused, stared, and whispered. It wasn't just another statue. It was something the city had never seen before, a freestanding nude in the round, the first since antiquity, standing not in a temple to Jupiter or Mars, but in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. To put it bluntly, Donatello had resurrected a form of art that had been buried for nearly 1,000 years, and he did it with a boldness that still feels shocking today. Let's start with the sheer audacity of making David nude. Medieval tradition clothed its heroes, saints, and prophets in heavy drapery, draping them in dignity and modesty. Donatello stripped all that away. His David stands entirely bare except for boots and a hat, a soft, almost playful hat with a feather curling up his leg, which only adds to the provocation. This wasn't the heroic giant killer most people imagined. This was a slender, youthful boy, 1 foot resting on Goliath's severed head, his body relaxed, his expression serene, almost ambiguous. You know what makes it extraordinary? The tension between innocence and sensuality. David's face is calm, almost distant, but his body tells a different story. The gentle contrapposto, the shift of weight onto one leg, gives his form a languid ease. His torso curves with a softness that suggests vulnerability rather than brute force. The feather from Goliath's helmet, curling along David's thigh, seems less like an accessory and more like a deliberate, daring detail. For a public steeped in Christian morality, this mixture of biblical heroism and erotic undertone was unsettling. Some saw it as a celebration of divine victory through weakness, others saw it as dangerously sensual, even scandalous. And yet, that was the genius. Donatello wasn't giving Florence a safe civic mascot. He was forcing viewers to confront complexity. David is triumphant, but he's also fragile. He's victorious, but he's also sexualized. He's a symbol of Florence's defiance against larger powers, but he's also a reminder of how victory often comes through cunning and grace rather than brute force. The ambiguity is what gives the statue its electricity. Every time you look, you see something different. A boy, a hero, a symbol, a provocation. Placing the bronze David in the Medici courtyard only heightened the impact. Guests arriving at the palace would encounter him immediately, standing in the open, not tucked into a niche. His freestanding form demanded you walk around him, view him from every angle, and grapple with the boldness of his nudity. For the Medici, this was more than decoration. It was a statement of power. They were saying, we sponsor the kind of art that no one else dares. We are the keepers of antiquity reborn. The statue was both a political emblem and a cultural experiment. Technically, too, the bronze David was a marvel. Casting a life-size nude in lost wax bronze was risky. The details, his hair, the smoothness of his limbs, the delicacy of the feather, show Donatello's mastery of the medium. It was light and graceful where bronze usually felt heavy and monumental. He treated the metal like flesh, bending it toward softness. That feat alone set him apart from most of his contemporaries, who still thought of bronze primarily in terms of weight and solidity. Honestly, the bronze David might be Donatello's most daring work, not because of size or technical complexity, but because of what it dared to say. In a time when Florence was torn between piety and pride, Donatello carved out a middle ground that was neither safe nor simple. He gave the city a hero who was also a boy, a nude who was also a civic emblem, a statue that blurred lines between sacred, sensual, and political. That kind of ambiguity is rare in art, and it's what keeps this David alive centuries later. It's almost poetic that Michelangelo, decades after Donatello's death, would carve his own David, a giant, muscular titan of stone that dwarfed Donatello's slender boy. Michelangelo's version is all about monumental strength and clarity. Donatello's, by contrast, whispers rather than shouts, unsettles rather than reassures. Together, they form a dialogue across time, two visions of Florence, two visions of heroism. And in many ways, Donatello's is the braver of the two, because it dares to leave the viewer uncertain. After the triumph and controversy of the Bronze David, Donatello didn't simply settle into the comfort of Medici commissions. Restlessness was woven into his nature. He moved, he wandered, he sought challenges outside Florence. Siena and Prato became important stops in this part of his journey, not only because they gave him fresh patrons and projects, but because they gave him space to experiment with styles that might not have fit neatly within Florence's charged artistic politics. In Siena, Donatello had already made his mark with the Feast of Herod relief for the baptismal font, but his involvement with the city didn't end there. He collaborated with other sculptors, including Ghiberti's workshop, on a series of reliefs and figures. Siena's cathedral, with its striped marble and dizzying Gothic richness, was almost a foil to Florence's architectural sobriety. Here, Donatello's reliefs stood out not by blending in, but by cutting through the clutter with startling realism. Siena gave him a kind of laboratory, an away-from-home stage where he could test out perspective, space, and narrative on an audience that was slightly less bound by Florence's committee rivalries. Prato, meanwhile, offered something entirely different, a chance to create public works that were both civic and playful. One of his most delightful commissions there was the pulpit of the cathedral, a collaboration with his assistant Michelozzo. The pulpit wasn't just a solemn platform for preaching, it became a place of exuberant ornament. Donatello filled it with dancing putty, little winged children carved in marble, cavorting with such energy that they seemed ready to tumble off the ledge. This was Donatello's lighter side, a contrast to the solemn saints and tense warriors of Florence. You know what's remarkable? Those playful putty became a motif that echoed throughout Renaissance art. Painters like Filippo Lippi and sculptors like Verrocchio picked them up, scattering them across canvases and altars. Donatello didn't just decorate a pulpit, he injected a new visual language into the bloodstream of Italian art. It's another reminder that his influence wasn't limited to serious works. Even in lighthearted details, he left fingerprints that others would follow for decades. These wanderings also reveal Donatello's adaptability. In Florence, he often had to walk a tightrope between guild committees, Medici patrons, and rival artists. In Siena and Prato, he had more freedom to let his imagination wander. That freedom sharpened his skills and expanded his vocabulary. When he eventually returned to Florence, he carried with him not only the confidence of someone who had succeeded elsewhere, but also new tricks, new motifs, and a renewed sense of daring. Honestly, I think of this period as Donatello's fieldwork years. Like a scientist gathering data in different environments, he exposed himself to fresh conditions, tested hypotheses, and brought the results back home. Siena gave him narrative reliefs that pushed perspective to its limits. Prato gave him joyous ornament that captured movement and play. Together, these experiences widened the range of what Donatello could do and proved that his genius wasn't confined to Florence's narrow streets. And perhaps that's why, when his career later took him all the way to Padua, he was ready for the scale and ambition of those northern projects. Siena and Prato were the warm-ups, the middle chapters of a restless journey that kept Donatello forever on the move, always searching for the next challenge. When Donatello set out for Padua in the early 1440s, it was more than just another job. It was a leap into a new world. Padua, in the Veneto region, was a university town, a place of learning and humanist scholarship, buzzing with intellectual life that rivaled Florence in its own way. For Donatello, already seasoned by years of bold experiments, Padua offered something Florence could no longer give him: a fresh stage, free from the old rivalries with Ghiberti or the constant political balancing act of Medici patronage. Here, he could stretch his ambitions on a monumental scale. The commissions that awaited him were nothing short of prestigious. Chief among them was the high altar for the Basilica of Sant'Antonio, an enormous, multifaceted project that demanded figures, reliefs, and architectural settings, all harmonized into a single ensemble. For a sculptor, it was the kind of commission that could make or break a career. Donatello didn't hesitate. He poured himself into it, creating bronze reliefs and life-sized figures that pushed every skill he had to the limit. But perhaps the most famous and daring work of his Padua years was the equestrian statue of Gattamelata, Erasmo de Narni, the Venetian condottiere. Until Donatello, equestrian statues of that scale hadn't been attempted in Italy since antiquity. To put a warrior on horseback in bronze, larger than life, standing in a public square, it was a conscious revival of Roman imperial grandeur. Donatello wasn't just making a monument, he was resurrecting an entire tradition, placing Padua in the lineage of ancient Rome. Here's the thing, Padua wasn't Florence. The audiences were different, the patrons different, the expectations different. In Florence, civic and religious imagery had to walk a fine line between Republican ideals and Medici ambition. In Padua, the goal was more straightforward: glorify power, immortalize memory, and celebrate human achievement. That suited Donatello perfectly. He wasn't bound by cautious committees, he was given space to be bold. The move also placed him in a fertile intellectual environment. Padua's university was a hub of humanist thought, where scholars studied Aristotle, Plato, and Roman law. That intellectual air fed Donatello's imagination. You can see it in his figures from this period, their gestures more eloquent, their faces etched with psychological depth, their bodies grounded in classical weight. It wasn't just that he had studied Rome decades earlier. In Padua, he was living in a place where Roman ideals were actively debated and revived. His art became a visual counterpart to those conversations. Honestly, the Padua years feel like Donatello at full stride. He wasn't experimenting timidly anymore. He was commanding. The altar reliefs, the saints, the equestrian monument, each one felt like a declaration that sculpture could stand on equal footing with architecture, painting, even philosophy. He wasn't just filling niches, he was reshaping public space, demanding viewers confront art as part of civic life. And yet, Padua wasn't just about power and prestige. It was also about freedom. Away from Florence's tangled web of politics and rivalries, Donatello could let his imagination stretch. That freedom, combined with the scale of his commissions, pushed him into territory that would echo across the Renaissance. The Gattamelata statue alone became a model for generations of artists, showing that bronze could be monumental, that Renaissance cities could claim the grandeur of Caesar's Rome in their own piazzas. When Donatello eventually returned to Florence after his Padua sojourn, he came back changed, more confident, more ambitious, and more experimental than ever. Padua had given him the platform to prove he could work at the very highest level of artistic and technical daring. Florence would feel the shockwaves of that experience for the rest of his career. The equestrian statue of Gattamelata, completed around 1453, stands in the piazza before the Basilica of Sant'Antonio in Padua, and it is one of those works that makes you stop and think, how did he dare this? For nearly a millennium, Europe hadn't seen a full-scale equestrian bronze in the style of ancient Rome. The tradition had all but vanished, save for the weathered statue of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, which survived only because medieval Christians mistook it for Constantine. Donatello, in taking on this commission, wasn't just making a monument, he was resurrecting a forgotten genre and proving that Renaissance ambition could match, even surpass, the feats of antiquity. Erasmo de Narni, nicknamed Gattamelata, the honeyed cat, was a condottiere, a mercenary commander who had fought for Venice. By the time of his death, he was celebrated as a defender of Padua, a man who had secured the city's independence under Venetian protection. The commission for his statue was both civic and political. Padua wanted to honor its hero, and Venice wanted to project its power through him. Donatello delivered something that embodied both aims. The statue is monumental. Gattamelata sits astride his horse, not rearing dramatically like later Baroque monuments, but calm, composed, steady. That composure is the key. Donatello wasn't interested in theatrical flourish. Instead, he gave the general the gravitas of a Roman consul. His horse is muscular but controlled, one hoof lifted slightly as if mid-step. Gadamelida himself is armored, his face stern and unsentimental, his hand resting firmly on the reins. There's no exaggeration, no mythologizing into godlike proportions. He is human, but human with weight, dignified, commanding, eternal. You know what's brilliant? Donatello didn't have to lean on symbols to convey power. In earlier medieval monuments, generals might be flanked by angels or laden with allegory. Donatello stripped all that away. He trusted the realism of the man and the horse, cast in bronze and elevated on a tall pedestal, to do the work. In that restraint lies the grandeur. It's almost cinematic in its understatement, the quiet general who says more by sitting still than others do by shouting. The technical feat alone was staggering. Casting a life-sized horse and rider in bronze, using the lost wax method, was fraught with risk. The mold had to be perfect, the pour flawless. Any flaw could ruin months of work. And bronze wasn't cheap, it required massive amounts of metal, smelted, refined, poured at searing temperatures. Donatello had to coordinate teams of metalworkers, engineers, assistants, all while overseeing the artistic vision. He wasn't just sculptor here, he was project manager, scientist, and gambler. That it succeeded at all is a testament to his nerve. And then there's the pedestal. Donatello designed it with relief panels and decorative details that amplify the statue's presence. The base isn't just a platform, it's part of the storytelling. From it, Gadamelida rises not as a passing commander, but as a figure rooted in history, grounded in Roman authority. The whole ensemble declares, here is power, here is memory, here is continuity with the grandeur of the ancients. Honestly, the Gadamelida feels like one of those moments when art and politics fuse completely. For Padua, it was a statement of pride. For Venice, it was a reminder of military might. For Donatello, it was proof that sculpture could claim the monumental scale of architecture and the historical weight of Rome. It wasn't just about honoring one man, it was about proving what Renaissance art could achieve. Later generations of sculptors would study this work obsessively. Verrocchio's equestrian statue of Colleone in Venice owes it everything. Even centuries later, when Bernini staged his theatrical Baroque monuments, he was working in the shadow of Donatello's calm, commanding bronze. The Gadamelida opened the door for equestrian monuments to return to European cities, not as curiosities, but as symbols of civic pride and political authority. And perhaps the most remarkable thing? Donatello didn't try to make Gadamelida immortal by turning him into a god. He made him immortal by showing him as he was a man of discipline, a soldier, steady on his horse, looking forward as though the city's fate rested on his gaze. That honesty, that balance of realism and monumentality, is what gives the statue its enduring power. The high altar of Sant'Antonio in Padua is one of those projects that makes you realize just how much faith patrons had in Donatello and how much Donatello relished risk. Imagine walking into the great basilica, the air heavy with incense, sunlight breaking through stained glass, and there in the choir stands not a simple altar, but an overwhelming bronze spectacle, life-sized saints, angels, reliefs filled with stories, all bound together into a dazzling whole. It was less an altar than a theater of faith, and Donatello was the director. This wasn't a small commission. The friars of Sant'Antonio wanted something that would honor their saint, proclaim Padua's piety, and impress the endless stream of pilgrims who visited the shrine. Donatello responded by creating a bronze ensemble unlike anything Italy had seen. He cast a series of larger-than-life figures, saints, the Virgin, Child, angels, all arranged in dialogue around the altar. He added relief panels showing miracles of Saint Anthony, each packed with figures that seemed to breathe, gesture, even argue. The whole thing shimmered with a kind of restless energy. What's striking is how Donatello treated narrative in the reliefs. Instead of neat, orderly scenes, he filled them with psychological tension. One relief shows the miracle of the speaking newborn. A baby testifies in court to defend his mother against false accusations. Rather than present this calmly, Donatello carved a crowd that leans in, whispers, recoils, faces caught in disbelief, awe, suspicion. It feels chaotic, human, alive. Another panel, The Miracle of the Miser's Heart, shows surgeons cutting open a dead man to find his heart missing. The figures around them express revulsion and astonishment. Donatello wasn't afraid to put discomfort into holy scenes. He believed drama conveyed truth more powerfully than pious calm. And then there are the bronze statues that crown the altar. Saints Peter and Paul, Anthony and Francis, each one different, each one imbued with its own mood. Peter grips the keys, stern and unyielding. Francis bows with humility, drapery clinging to his thin frame. Anthony, Padua's beloved saint, is tender, approachable, caught mid-gesture as if turning to the faithful themselves. Donatello gave each figure individuality, not generic saintliness. It was as if he wanted worshippers to recognize them as fellow humans who happened to carry divine purpose. Technically, the altar is a marvel. Casting so many life-size bronzes, assembling them into a unified architectural framework, balancing weight and proportion, this was engineering as much as art. Donatello orchestrated it all, proving once again that he wasn't merely a sculptor, but a master builder of experiences. Standing before the altar, you don't just see isolated works, you feel encompassed by a world of figures, almost as if you've stepped onto a stage with them. You know what's fascinating? The friars may have expected something more restrained, more traditional. What they got was a kind of Renaissance drama in bronze, a blend of sacred narrative and raw human theater. Not everyone was pleased. Some critics thought it too chaotic, too emotional, too modern. But pilgrims kept coming, and the altar became a landmark, reinforcing Padua's reputation as a place where faith and art collided at the highest level. Honestly, when you think of Donatello in Padua, this altar feels like the perfect counterpart to the Gattamelata. The equestrian statue embodied civic pride and Roman grandeur. The altar embodied religious fervor and human emotion. Together, they showed the full spectrum of what Donatello could do: monumental calm on the piazza, dramatic intensity within the basilica. And perhaps that's why his time in Padua stands as the peak of his career. He had the freedom, the patrons, the technical support, and the imagination to stretch every boundary. The high altar wasn't just an object of devotion, it was a declaration that sculpture could carry narrative, psychology, and architecture all at once. It was Donatello at his boldest, daring worshippers to see saints not as distant icons, but as figures caught in the same storm of emotions as themselves. When Donatello finally returned to Florence in the late 1450s, after his triumphant years in Padua, he came back not as the restless youth who had once fought for commissions alongside Ghiberti, but as a man in his 70s, weathered, famous, and utterly unwilling to play safe. You might expect an aging sculptor to lean on past formulas, to cash in on reputation and repeat earlier successes. Donatello did the opposite. If anything, his late works became stranger, more experimental, more raw than ever before. It was as though he sensed time was short and wanted to pour everything he had left into art that shocked, unsettled, and pushed boundaries. Florence had changed, too. The Medici were more entrenched than ever as the city's unofficial rulers, and Cosimo de' Medici, Donatello's great patron, was nearing the end of his life. Younger artists like Luca della Robbia were earning attention with their serene terracotta reliefs, while others like Andrea del Castagno painted bold, almost violent frescoes. Into this evolving landscape, Donatello reinserted himself, not as a conservative master resting on laurels, but as a provocateur, still challenging what sculpture could mean. One of his first projects after returning was the series of pulpits for San Lorenzo, the Medici family's parish church. These weren't conventional preaching platforms. Donatello filled them with bronze reliefs so packed with figures, so alive with motion, that they look almost chaotic. The Passion reliefs, in particular, seethe with intensity. Christ is dragged, beaten, mocked, faces twist in anger or fear, bodies overlap, lines blur. It's hard to read at first glance, almost overwhelming. But that's the point. Donatello wasn't interested in tidy, legible narrative anymore. He wanted viewers to feel the confusion, the panic, the storm of emotions that surrounded Christ's final hours. You know what's remarkable? These late works are closer to expressionism than to classical harmony. The figures are elongated, distorted, almost grotesque at times. Their faces are masks of grief or rage, their movements exaggerated to the edge of chaos. For Renaissance Florence, so proud of balance, proportion, and clarity, Donatello's pulpits must have felt like an earthquake. Some contemporaries likely thought he had gone too far, that old age had made him reckless. But others saw the genius. He was breaking rules not out of ignorance, but out of mastery. He had learned all the laws of proportion and perspective, and now, in his final years, he was choosing to bend and even break them in pursuit of raw emotional truth. This return also reunited him with familiar patrons. The Medici still backed him, though Cosimo's death in 1464 meant the relationship shifted under new leadership. Yet Donatello, by now, wasn't a man who needed protection. His fame carried him. His workshop was still active, though his assistants often struggled to keep up with his demands. He wasn't easy to work with, never had been, but his late works suggest a man who knew exactly what he wanted and refused compromise. Honestly, I think of Donatello's return to Florence as his second debut. He came back not as the eager apprentice carving saints for niches, nor as the daring young man who made Florence's first nude David, but as an old master unafraid of discomfort. Where others sought harmony, he chased dissonance. Where others polished surfaces, he left them rough, jagged, alive with shadows. He wasn't trying to reassure Florence of its greatness. He was reminding it of its fragility, its struggles, its humanity. It's fitting, in a way, that his late Florence years feel darker, heavier. The city itself was changing, internal tensions, shifting alliances, threats from outside powers. Donatello's art absorbed that atmosphere. His saints looked less like serene intercessors and more like weary participants in the drama of human life. He gave Florence, once again, art that wasn't safe, but unforgettable. The pulpits of San Lorenzo are among Donatello's strangest and most powerful creations, and they show just how far he was willing to go in his final years. Commissioned for the Medici Church, Cosimo's parish, no less, they weren't meant to be radical statements. They were meant to be functional, platforms from which sermons could be delivered. Yet, in Donatello's hands, they became something else entirely. They turned into bronze theaters of suffering, chaotic visions of Christ's passion that feel almost modern in their intensity. Walk up to them, and you don't see orderly rows of apostles or tidy gospel scenes. Instead, you're assaulted by a flood of bodies, soldiers shoving, disciples recoiling, Christ dragged forward, jeering faces pressed into the frame. It's crowded, it's noisy, and it's deliberately overwhelming. Donatello wasn't sculpting for comfort. He was sculpting to plunge the viewer into the storm of emotions surrounding Christ's final hours. One panel shows the flagellation of Christ, and it's brutal. The soldiers' whips almost blur into motion. The bodies twist unnaturally. Christ's figure bends with a vulnerability that makes you wince. Another shows the crucifixion, but instead of calm witnesses, you see women collapsing, soldiers barking, the crowd surging in chaos. The figures aren't polished like Ghiberti's elegant reliefs. They're raw, jagged, sometimes almost grotesque. It's as if Donatello no longer cared about classical beauty. He cared about truth, the truth of violence, grief, fear, and faith pushed to the edge. Here's the thing, these pulpits are almost cinematic. They anticipate the way later painters like Caravaggio or even filmmakers would throw viewers into the middle of a scene. The perspective lines don't just organize space, they drag you into it. The figures overlap, tangle, fight for room, just as real people would in a crowd. The reliefs don't read left to right like orderly narratives, they hit you all at once, like the shock of walking into a riot. And yet, amid the chaos, there's focus. Christ is always at the center, not because Donatello isolates him, but because the storm swirls around him. Your eye can't help but return to his bent form, his suffering face, his fragile body. That contrast between the frenzy of the crowd and the stillness of Christ is what gives the panels their emotional punch. You feel the noise, the confusion, the cruelty, but you also feel the weight of sacrifice, the quiet core at the heart of the storm. Many contemporaries didn't know what to make of these works. Some found them too dark, too harsh, even unbeautiful. But others recognized that Donatello was breaking new ground. He wasn't sculpting for decoration anymore. He was sculpting to make you feel. His pulpits are less about theology than about empathy, forcing worshippers to step into the shoes of those who witnessed Christ's passion, to feel their shock, horror, and grief. Honestly, it's hard not to see these late works as Donatello's farewell, his last word on what sculpture could do. They're stripped of elegance, stripped of comfort, stripped even of the balance he had mastered earlier in his career. What remains is raw expression, as if his chisel and bronze were channeling emotions too deep for words. Some art historians call this Donatello's expressionist phase, and it's not a bad description. Centuries before the term existed, he was already showing that art could distort form to reveal truth. The pulpits of San Lorenzo remind us that Donatello never settled. Even in his 70s, when he could have coasted on his reputation, he chose to take risks that unsettled his audience. He gave Florence and the Medici not what they expected, but what he felt was necessary, a vision of faith that was unvarnished, emotional, and uncomfortably human. And in doing so, he left behind works that still feel startling, as if they were made not 6 centuries ago, but yesterday. Donatello's late years weren't only about monumental bronze. He also turned to humbler materials, wood and terracotta, and in doing so, he revealed a side of himself that was raw, intimate, and almost unbearably human. If bronze was about grandeur and permanence, wood and clay were about vulnerability, immediacy, and touch. And Donatello, never afraid to unsettle, used those lesser materials to craft some of his most haunting works. One of the most famous is the wooden Magdalene penitent, carved for the baptistry in Florence. Forget the radiant Magdalene of traditional art, clothed in flowing robes or depicted as a beautiful convert. Donatello's Magdalene is gaunt, aged, hollow-eyed. Her hair, matted and wild, clings to her skeletal frame like rags. Her hands, clasped in prayer, are bony and desperate. Her face, carved with deep lines, radiates both suffering and faith. It's not a comfortable image. It's one that forces you to see the toll of penitence, the fragility of the body, the cost of devotion. Standing before her, you feel not admiration but empathy and maybe even a shiver. You know what's extraordinary? The choice of wood itself. Wood is perishable, prone to decay, far less noble than marble or bronze. But that impermanence suited the subject. Magdalene's body is wasting away, her earthly beauty gone. The wood almost participates in the theme, reminding viewers that flesh, like material, doesn't last. Some historians believe Donatello may even have painted the figure originally, adding lifelike colors to intensify the effect. Whether or not that's true, the starkness of the carving alone is enough to pierce through centuries. Terracotta offered another avenue. Donatello used clay not for large monuments, but for devotional pieces, madonnas, reliefs, small figures. What makes them special is their immediacy. Clay, being malleable, allowed Donatello to work quickly, pressing, smoothing, scratching until forms emerged. That speed gave the works a kind of sketch-like vitality, as though you can still feel his hands in the surface. The Madonna of the Clouds, for example, shows Mary surrounded by angels in shallow relief, their faces tender and alive. It's not about grandeur, but about closeness, an image for private prayer, intimate and warm. These experiments remind us that Donatello wasn't obsessed only with impressing cities or patrons. He also cared about the personal, the fragile, the everyday expressions of faith. In wood and clay, he could strip away the monumental scale and focus instead on the emotional pulse of a single figure. Where his bronzes demanded awe, his wooden Magdalene and terracotta Madonnas invited contemplation, even tears. Honestly, I find these works some of his most daring. They break entirely from the polished ideals of the Renaissance. They aren't beautiful in the conventional sense. They're rough, unsettling, even grotesque at times. And yet, they speak directly to human experience, aging, suffering, praying, hoping. Donatello knew that art didn't have to flatter to be true. Sometimes, The rawer the material and the rougher the finish, the deeper the connection. In many ways, these wooden and terracotta pieces anticipate later movements in art that embraced imperfection and emotion over polish. They show us a Donatello who, even in old age, refused to stop experimenting. He moved from the monumental to the intimate, from the eternal bronze to the fragile wood, proving that every material could carry meaning if handled with honesty. And so, in the Magdalene's gaunt face or the Madonna's tender gaze pressed into clay, we see not just Donatello the innovator, but Donatello the humanist, forever trying to capture the depths of what it means to be human, fragile, flawed, but capable of grace. By the time Donatello entered his final decade, his religious works had taken on an intensity that startled his contemporaries. Gone was the balanced calm of his St. George or the polished elegance of his early saints. What emerged instead were figures that seemed almost torn apart by grief, fear, or devotion. In these late works, Donatello wasn't sculpting icons to inspire distant reverence. He was sculpting human beings caught in the grip of overwhelming emotion. One example is his Judith and Holofernes, originally created for the Medici Gardens. Here, the biblical heroine doesn't appear as a graceful beauty delicately holding a sword. She's a woman in the very act of violence, standing over Holofernes with grim determination. Her face is stern, her body taut, her arms raised as she prepares to strike. Holofernes, slumped beneath her, is not a symbol but a body limp, vulnerable, defeated. There's no attempt to soften the scene, no attempt to make it decorative. It's a raw confrontation with the moment of justice, tinged with brutality. When Florence later displayed the statue publicly, it became a political emblem of Republican virtue toppling tyranny. But at its core, it's also a deeply human drama of power and survival. Even more unsettling are some of his crucifixion reliefs and passion scenes. Christ in Donatello's late works doesn't look serene or triumphant. He looks broken, his body sagging, his face twisted in pain. Surrounding figures weep, wail, or gesture wildly, their emotions so exaggerated they verge on distortion. These aren't scenes for detached contemplation. They're confrontations. They force viewers to reckon with suffering in a visceral way. You know what's fascinating? Some scholars argue that these late works verge on expressionism, centuries before the term existed. Donatello distorts proportion, exaggerates gestures, carves lines so deep they almost scar the surface. He sacrifices harmony for impact, clarity for emotion. In doing so, he anticipates the idea that art can express inner truth even at the expense of outer beauty. That was radical in a Florence that prized balance, proportion, and classical ideals. His wooden Magdalene penitent fits into this phase, too. Its gaunt, starving body is less about beauty than about spiritual desperation. And his bronze reliefs for the pulpits at San Lorenzo, crammed with writhing bodies, have the same intensity, faith shown not as calm devotion, but as chaos, struggle, even terror. It's as if Donatello, in his last years, was less interested in giving comfort and more interested in forcing honesty. Honestly, I can't help but see these works as Donatello's own confrontation with mortality. He was old, frail, aware that his body was failing. Maybe that's why his late saints look weary, why his crucifixion scream, why his Magdalene wastes away. He wasn't imagining these things in the abstract. He was living them. His art became a mirror of human fragility in the face of death and faith. And yet, even in their harshness, these works carry a strange kind of hope. The Magdalene still prays. Christ, though broken, still endures. Judith still raises her sword. Donatello seemed to believe that honesty about suffering was itself a form of devotion, that facing pain directly was more faithful than pretending it didn't exist. So in his late religious works, we don't see Donatello trying to flatter the church or please committees. We see an old man, unafraid of ugliness, using sculpture to wrestle with the hardest truths of life. That's why they still move us, even unsettle us, centuries later. They aren't beautiful in the Renaissance sense. They're beautiful in the human sense because they feel true. By the 1460s, Donatello was an old man. His body, once strong enough to wrestle blocks of marble and oversee colossal bronze pours, had begun to betray him. He suffered bouts of illness, his hands trembled at times, and his energy came in unpredictable bursts. Yet, even as frailty crept in, his determination never waned. If anything, the stubborn fire inside him seemed to burn hotter. He kept taking on commissions that would have exhausted a man half his age, insisting on pushing his art further, even if it meant leaving works unfinished. One poignant example comes from his work on the pulpits of San Lorenzo. By then, Donatello was in his 70s, struggling with age and illness. His assistants, including Bertoldo di Giovanni, often had to carry out parts of the work under his guidance. And yet, the intensity of those reliefs, the jagged lines, the crowded figures, the raw emotion, bears his unmistakable hand. It's as though the urgency of his failing body spilled into the urgency of his art. He didn't have time to polish, to refine, to make things pretty. He carved straight into the essence, leaving the rough edges as part of the truth. You know what's striking? Even his unfinished works seem intentional, as if incompleteness was a form of honesty. A relief might trail off where the figures blur into the background. A surface might stay rough, the tool marks visible. To later viewers, these could look like accidents of age, the product of a master too tired to finish. But they also feel deeply expressive, almost modern, as though Donatello is saying, perfection is overrated, truth is enough. His frailty also revealed the depth of his friendships. Cosimo de' Medici, his longtime patron and protector, had died in 1464, but the Medici family continued to support him. They ensured he had a workshop, assistants, and commissions, even when his health faltered. It's said that Donatello lived in Cosimo's old palace in his final years, treated less like a servant of art and more like a member of the family. That closeness gave him stability, but it also placed him face to face with the reality of death, Cosimo gone, his own time drawing near. His art absorbed that melancholy. Yet Donatello refused to stop. Stories from his later years describe him working while sick, pushing through pain, obsessed with finishing projects even when his body told him to rest. He knew he wouldn't live to see all of his ideas realized, but he worked anyway. That stubbornness is part of his legend, the frail old sculptor, hunched and coughing, still demanding molten bronze be poured, still sketching figures with shaky hands, still chasing visions only he could see. Honestly, there's something both heartbreaking and inspiring about this final phase. Heartbreaking because you can sense the toll, unfinished projects, assistants stepping in, the brilliance sometimes clouded by exhaustion. Inspiring because the creative fire never dimmed. Donatello wasn't sculpting for money anymore, or even for fame. He was sculpting because he couldn't not. It was the rhythm of his life, the way he spoke to the world, and he carried it until the very end. In those frail years, Donatello gave us works that feel less like polished monuments and more like confessions. They're raw, jagged, incomplete, like life itself. And that, perhaps, is why they resonate so deeply. They remind us that even as the body breaks down, the spirit can carve on, stubborn and unyielding. Donatello's final years slipped away in Florence, the city where he had been born, where he had fought his fiercest artistic battles, and where his work still looked out over piazzas and church facades. He died in December of 1466, around the age of 80, an astonishing lifespan for the 15th century, especially for a man who had worked his body so hard. By then, he was revered as one of the greatest sculptors of his age, though revered doesn't quite capture it. People in Florence spoke of him with a mix of awe, bewilderment, and even unease. His art had always been too bold, too raw, too different to fit neatly into a box. But in death, the city acknowledged what perhaps it hadn't fully admitted in life. Donatello had changed sculpture forever. His burial took place in the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the Medici's own church, where he had spent years laboring over pulpits and reliefs. That in itself was extraordinary. Most artists of his time were laid to rest quietly, their graves forgotten or left unmarked. Donatello was honored with a tomb in one of Florence's most important sacred spaces, placed near Cosimo de' Medici, his greatest patron and friend. The gesture spoke volumes. Donatello wasn't just a craftsman. He was family to the Medici, part of the city's legacy, a figure whose name would stand alongside rulers and thinkers. You know what's poignant? Unlike Ghiberti, who basked in fame and left behind the glittering gates of paradise, Donatello's reputation at the time of his death was more complicated. He was admired, yes, but his late works puzzled people. The jagged bronze reliefs, the gaunt Magdalene, the unfinished pulpits, they weren't beautiful in the traditional sense. Some Florentines may have wondered if the old master had gone too far, if illness had pushed him into strangeness. And yet, even those doubts became part of his legend. Donatello was remembered as the one who dared, the one who didn't care if his works unsettled, the one who kept experimenting until the end. His apprentices and assistants, especially Bertoldo di Giovanni, carried on his workshop and teachings. Through them, Donatello's influence rippled into the next generation of artists. Bertoldo later taught young sculptors under Medici patronage, among them a certain Michelangelo Buonarroti. It's no exaggeration to say that without Donatello, there would be no Michelangelo as we know him. The lineage runs straight. Donatello's realism, his willingness to strip saints of ideal beauty, his courage in handling the nude, all of it reemerges in Michelangelo's Titanic figures. Florence itself kept his memory alive. The David, the St. George, the pulpits of San Lorenzo, they remained in public view, challenging new viewers century after century. Unlike many artists whose reputations faded quickly after death, Donatello's presence never really vanished. The city that had shaped him also chose to enshrine him, literally and figuratively, in its heart. Honestly, I think there's something fitting about Donatello's farewell being both celebrated and unsettled. His art was never about neat conclusions. It was about tension between beauty and truth, between faith and flesh, between antiquity and the present. In death, as in life, he left Florence with questions rather than answers. That's why his tomb doesn't feel like an ending so much as a pause, a comma in a story that continued in every artist who came after him. And so, when the bells of Florence tolled for Donatello in 1466, they weren't just marking the passing of a man. They were marking the close of a chapter in art history, a chapter that had cracked open the possibilities of sculpture and given voice to a restless hand that never stopped carving at the boundaries of tradition. Donatello's legacy is hard to overstate. When he died in 1466, his body was laid to rest in Florence, but his ideas kept moving, rippling outward across centuries. He wasn't simply another name in the Renaissance roll call. He was a hinge, a turning point, a sculptor who picked up the fragments of antiquity, fused them with the anxieties and ambitions of his own age, and left behind a language of form that future artists would inherit, challenge, and expand. Michelangelo, most famously, drank deeply from Donatello's cup. Without Donatello's marble Saint John the Evangelist and marble David, could Michelangelo have dared his own colossal David? Without Donatello's bronze David, provocative, nude, unsettling, would Michelangelo have had the courage to carve a biblical hero completely unclothed? The connection is undeniable. Even in Michelangelo's mighty, muscular figures, you can sense Donatello's precedent, the tension between vulnerability and defiance, the conviction that the human body is enough to carry divine and civic meaning. Then there's Bernini, a century and a half later, who turned marble into a theater of drama during the Baroque. His swooning saints, his swirling draperies, his explosive narratives, all of them echo the emotional intensity Donatello had explored in his late works. Those jagged San Lorenzo reliefs, those grotesque crucifixions, that gaunt Magdalene, they opened a door Bernini would fling wide, showing that sculpture could grip the viewer not with harmony, but with raw, overwhelming emotion. And it doesn't stop there. Modern sculpture, Rodin's The Thinker, for instance, owes something to Donatello's willingness to carve truth rather than polish. Rodin admired Donatello precisely for his imperfections, the rough surfaces, the distorted bodies, the sense of motion captured mid-stride. Donatello's figures don't always sit still. They shift, they breathe, they doubt. That quality feels astonishingly modern, as if he anticipated the 20th century's obsession with fractured form and restless energy. You know what's fascinating? Donatello's legacy isn't just about influence on individual artists. It's about influence on the very idea of sculpture. Before him, statues were mostly didactic, saints to inspire devotion, decorations to adorn cathedrals, civic symbols to assert power. Donatello proved they could be more: psychological portraits, human dramas, provocations, confessions. He made sculpture a medium of thought and feeling, not just of representation. That's why we still look at his works today and feel unnerved, moved, or compelled to walk around them again. Florence, of course, holds him closest. His St. George still gazes defiantly from Orsanmichele. His David still surprises visitors in the Bargello. His pulpits still stand in San Lorenzo, their chaos intact. But his reach extends far beyond Tuscany. Padua still looks up at Gattamelata as though he were alive, forever astride his bronze horse. Museums and historians still debate whether his late style was madness or genius. And sculptors, century after century, still return to him as a wellspring. Honestly, I think Donatello's greatest legacy is his refusal to settle. He never allowed himself to repeat safe formulas. He moved from marble to bronze to wood to clay, from saints to soldiers to dancing children, from serene balance to near-expressionist distortion. He never stopped experimenting, even when it baffled his contemporaries. That restlessness is what makes him timeless. He reminds us that art isn't about comfort. It's about searching, questioning, daring. So when we trace the line from antiquity to the Renaissance to the modern age, Donatello stands at the crossroads. A boy from a wool carter's family in Florence, he grew into an artist whose fingerprints are still on the shoulders of giants, from Michelangelo to Bernini to Rodin and beyond. And maybe that's the best way to understand him, not as a sculptor bound to one era, but as a restless hand forever reaching forward, carving the future from stone, bronze, wood, and faith.